Recently, I had several viewers ask me about resawing when they saw this video of me resawing 8-inch wide oak boards for the keel. In this video, I'm going to show you my 3 tips on how to resaw. So first off, what is resawing? Well, resawing is when you take a board or a plank for the boat, in my case, and you split the thickness of it going this direction. Now you may ask, well, isn't that the same as ripping a board? Well, ripping a board is when you split the width of the board this way. Clearly, this is much easier to do, for example, on a table saw, where when you're cutting, in this case, this is nearly a 6-inch board, a table saw won't go up high enough to do that. So that's where we need to resaw. In simple terms, it's taking a plank and splitting it in 2 so that you have 2 thinner planks. The first tip is the selection of the proper blade. And in this case, there are 2 factors. One is the width of the blade, and secondly is the number of teeth per linear inch on the blade. When we look here at this blade, we can see that this blade is a 1-inch wide blade. Now, there are a couple of factors on why we want this to be wider. The first is what I'm going to call beam strength, so that when you're pressing on here with the board, that the blade is not deflecting out this way, that it's keeping an even cut going through the board. The second is the wider a blade is, the less control you have in order to turn corners. So if you wanted to use your bandsaw and you wanted to make a tight radius, you'd use a very thin blade. If you want less control, which is what we want when we're resawing, because we want to saw very straight and even through that plank, we want a very wide blade. So then the next factor is the number of teeth per inch. And this blade in particular has 3 teeth per inch. And what is important about that is not only the fewer teeth that go through here is the size of this gullet. And the gullet is this small space down in here. So as this blade is going through this wood, it's collecting sawdust. If there are very fine teeth on here, there would not be a very deep gullet, so it would get built up. So with a deeper gullet, which means fewer teeth, then it's going to dispose of the sawdust in a much more efficient manner. So the next tip is to make sure that the saw is set up with the proper tensioning, alignment, and tracking. Before we do anything, we want to make sure the power is disconnected. Most saws come with a tensioning guide on them that will let you generally get the tension set according to the width of the blade. I like to check the tension by putting my finger here and pressing on it so that it doesn't deflect much more than 1/4 of an inch. After the tension is set, we can then turn our attention to the tracking. And the tracking is where that blade sits on the tire of the wheel. So tip number 2 is where that blade is positioned on that tire. And most manufacturers will suggest that the blade should sit right in the center of that tire. I have discovered several years ago when I had read about Alex Snodgrass's technique of not putting the blade in the center, but putting the blade so that the gullet is in the center, which makes a lot of sense because the tire has a slight camber or a crown to it. So by putting the gullet right in the middle there, that's where you're putting all of the tension. And when you think about that, that's where you're pushing the material into the blade, that's the part that you don't want to deflect. If that were in the center, then that front would be out in space as well as the back would be. And so then it would have more of a tendency that that blade could rock back and forth as you put pressure on it. Now, You might ask, well, what about the back side of it? Well, as you're pushing on the side, the back side simply is just like a trailing edge and takes care of itself. The other thing is to make sure that all of your thrust bearing and your side bearings are all set up properly as you would with any bandsaw operation. The thrust bearing should be adjusted so it's as close to the blade as it possibly could be, so that when you turn this, it doesn't actually rub the bearing. So the idea of the thrust bearing is that when you're pressing the wood into here, it won't let the blade deflect any more than it needs to. So the next thing are the side guides. And the side guides should be adjusted so that there's maybe about just not quite a 1/16 of an inch on each side, so that when that blade turns, so that these will turn freely, and again, when you turn this, that they don't rub against it, and that helps keep the blade from twisting back and forth and keeps it in line. Now, in addition to the top bearings and side guides, you also need to do that on the bottom one. So the next thing is to make sure that the table is a perfect 90 degrees to the blade. And let me get this closed up and plugged in, and I'll show you a little trick. So how this works is, if we take a board and we make a cut in here, we turn the dust collection on. If we just make a small cut, like so, and then once the blade is stopped, and we take the board and we turn it around and we bring it this way, that should match up perfectly in that cut. So we know when that's lined up properly, we know our table and our blade are at 90 degrees. Now, if for some reason that isn't quite right, then we would adjust the table accordingly. Now that we have our saw tensioned, tracking, and adjusted properly, we can move on to tip number 3. Tip number 3 is to get a resaw guide attached to your fence. This one is made by Kreg, and it's not terribly expensive. I think it's less than $25. But what is important about them is that they have just a little bit of a camber here, so that that needs to be lined up right with the gullet of the blade. Now, why this works so well, that as the board is going through here, and if the blade wants to drift any at all, you can just make micro adjustments like this, so that really all you have to do is pay attention that the board is right up against the apex of that guide. Now that adjustment is a little bit like riding a bike. It becomes to a point where you're not even conscious that you're doing it. It's just little micro adjustments like this. Now that we have the saw all set up, let's get a plank prepared and run it through the resaw and see how we do. The first thing I do to prepare my planking stock is to run it through the surface planer and get one side nice and true. The planking stock I needs to be 5/8 of an inch finished. So I set my guide up just a little bit more than 5/8, and I'll clean the rest of that up on the surface planer. So we have it, 2 uniform slices. One of them 5/8 of an inch, and the other one is looks like just a little under 1/4 of an inch. One of the things about resawing that is also as important is having a saw with enough power to do that. Now here's a bonus tip on how to recoil a bandsaw blade. Now one of the problems a lot of people have is recoiling saw blades, especially these big blades, which are a little tougher to do. So the way that I do it is I'm going to put a glove on it because these teeth are still pretty sharp. Now since I'm right-handed, I'm going to step with my right foot and I'm going to take my right hand and I'm going to turn my palm out and my thumb to the back. As I push down, I'm going to rotate 360 degrees. Foolproof way to do it every time. So I'll do it one more time so you can see it in slow motion. So one last thing is you want to bind this together. I'm going to use a little piece of wire here. Otherwise, you have a giant bear trap hanging in your shop. So as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.